This is They Create Worlds, episode 224, D&D and Video Games, 3rd edition.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We are fed. We are back. We are here to enjoy Part 3 in the future, enjoy Part 3 in the present, and marvel at the only Part 3 in the past.
That's right. This is the third and final part of our live stream extravaganza. Of course, these are coming out as 3 separate episodes for those of you that are listening to them the traditional way. But we filmed them all in one fell swoop, other than a little dinner break here or there, talking about Dungeons and Dragons and video games.
So, last time on They Create Worlds, we discovered such magical things as wargaming and how that led to this proto D&D. Then we learned about Dungeons and Dragons and the shenanigans thereof, how it proliferated, and how it became Satan's game, at least according to a small subset of people. Then some other people decided to take that and not actually look at it in any way, shape, or form, to realize it is really just nerds doing math, because nerds like doing math, and why not do it as a wizard?
That's right. Because there's nothing that Satan likes more than 2 hit tables.
That's right.
That's how he really gets the kids to sell their soul, is with those to-hit charts from first edition AD&D.
You must sell a part of your soul to understand how those work.
I mean, they may actually be onto something when you put it that way.
Quite possibly, quite possibly. But yes, finally, we get to that part of the episode, or the episode about the episode, that actually finishes off our little title screen here, where we get to talk about video games, as opposed to proto things about wargaming and people taunting others very cruelly in newspaper articles and private publications, all the way up to Dungeons and Dragons and people getting lost in steam tunnels, because that was a thing. We get to go into how a video game works, and why video games were just all about the Dungeons and Dragons, and really everything had to be RPG now. It needs Dungeons and Dragons and everything. You can have an RPG, and you can have an RPG, and you can have an RPG. You're a first-person shooter? Fine, you're having an RPG.
Yeah, well, we won't take it all the way out to there, because then we really would be doing 5 episodes. Can't have any of that. But yeah, we are going to look at the transition now where Dungeons and Dragons started to permeate video games. And we're not actually going to be looking at Dungeons and Dragons video games.
Aww.
As in licensed from the good folks at TSR, because that really happens a little bit later in the computer game space. Now, in this earlier period, you did have some licensing, of course, going on. You had the Mattel license for electronic handheld and console games on the Mattel Intellivision. But as we kind of hinted at the end of the last episode, TSR was very slow on the uptake when it came to this whole computer thing, and they weren't really interested in investing a whole lot into that space. Now, the Blooms, father and brothers, Melvin, Brian, and Kevin, were certainly interested in making money, a return on investment, because they've invested considerably into what has now become TSR Hobbies. Certainly, as well, Gary Gygax is becoming more and more focused on making money as well through this, which is not surprising. I can't really blame him, because he has a large family to support. And he's always just been barely eking by. He was an insurance underwriter, then he lost his job, he was doing freelance writing, then got himself a job as a cobbler, a shoe repair person, again working out of his home. And this was all very meager work to support a very large family. So I can understand why everyone's kind of looking to get paid. I mean, they're legitimately interested in the role-playing game space. I mean, Gygax is a true gamer, and even Brian Bloom came to this partnership through his love of these games. But they're not really exploring areas outside of their core competency of tabletop role-playing and strategy games. They did in the mid-'80s, but we're not going to really get into those. They had a very desultory attempt to do a little bit of computer game stuff, but it was really kind of pathetic. You know, they explored it a little bit, but they were mostly just happy to accept money from people that were willing to give them large amounts of money to license in these areas. And Mattel, being involved in this rip-roaring console business, is able to give them a lot of licensing money to, like, go make D&D games, and they actually kind of give them the rights to everything D&D, which is why when they do that little bit of game stuff in the 82, 83 kind of time frame, none of it's D&D stuff. But, you know, Mattel's not focused on computer games, and nobody else out there is going to be big enough to throw lots of money at them for computer game rights, so there aren't D&D computer games. There are console games and electronic handhelds, but of course, these are constrained by the platforms. They're not going to be really trying to encapsulate a lot of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. They're going to be far more action-based. You know, there's nothing excitingly official from TSR until the SSI Gold Box series in the late 1980s. Despite the fact that D&D is not officially becoming a computer game in this time period, it becomes unofficially a computer game, or there become computer simulations of Dungeons & Dragons game playing almost immediately. Like, right from the very start. It's not really hard to see why, quite frankly. Because we already talked about this in the last episode, but there was a big overlap between the initial D&D audience and college students. You had a fair number of college students getting into this game and playing this game together. You also, within that college cohort, had a pretty decent overlap between people who were playing both war games and these new tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, and those who were programming on the early computers, the mainframes and mini-computers that were present in university computer labs. Again, this really isn't that surprising when you stop and think about it, because Dungeons & Dragons is a system with a defined set of rules, sometimes a little wiggy in its original incarnation, but a defined set of rules. As the DM of that game, you get to plan out a campaign or a series of encounters based on that rule set, and if you're the players, you get to use that rule set in such a way as to try to overcome what the DM has prepared for you. This really all dovetails very well with what the appeal of computer programming is to a lot of people in this first generation of programmers, because a lot of them that have given interviews, both game makers and non-game makers, say that one of the things that attracted them to computing is that they were amazed that there was this big machine that you could give commands to, and it would, like, do what you wanted it to do. Like, you had control over it. It was a system that you could hijack for your own purposes, so to speak. That's exactly what Dungeons & Dragons was, too. It was a system with a defined set of rules, and then within those rules, you would program the scenario, so to speak, by using those rules to design encounters, if you're the DM, or if you're the player, using those rules to try to overcome those encounters. You have a lot of control, you have a lot of agency in what happens in those games. There's a pretty sizable overlap there. Again, it's nowhere near a circle. There are plenty of people that were into computers that just were not interested in D&D or war games at all. But there were a fair number who absolutely were interested in all of those things and were very eager to take this new and exciting game that they're playing with their friends and recreate it on these computers that they're spending so much time with. This really took a lot of different forms, some of which are not necessarily what you would expect based on the original way that most people play Dungeons & Dragons. Obviously, there was a lot of room for interpretation, and we already talked about how different groups of people would play it different ways. If you're a hardcore wargamer, you're probably more focused on the gameplay mechanics and the individual combat encounters, where if you're one of these science fiction and fantasy literature fans, you may be more drawn to the ability to create a character and develop a story around that character. But the rules themselves, coming from two groups of hardcore military miniatures wargamers, Gygax's and Arneson's groups, certainly emphasized in its earliest forms that combat side of things. Dungeons & Dragons was very much about creating a character, descending into a dungeon, overcoming monsters and traps to get loot and to get experience so that you could improve your character and take on harder challenges for greater treasure and all of this kind of thing. Yes, and as Ethan points out in the chat, and this persisted in second edition as well, belying the wargaming roots, become high enough level that you get to establish your own stronghold and have your own group of followers, and then have them do all the hard work for you. Because it still had a little bit of that kind of wargaming root in it. No, I know it was an OD&D, Ethan. What I was saying is that it persisted even into second edition AD&D. They still had that wargaming element, even in the later editions. Yeah, you could theoretically take it another direction, and some groups certainly did, but that's kind of the intended way to play in the beginning. This was further reinforced because, of course, a lot of the ways that people discovered the game was through discovering it at conventions like Gen Con and Origins. TSR would run official adventures there. These adventures were always geared around going into a dungeon and killing monsters, and were often very brutal as well, because these were often tournament dungeons, which meant that you were actually scored on how well you did on them. You know, groups of players would be run through the same dungeon at intervals, and everyone would be scored on how they did. So, of course, they needed a way to weed out players, and that way was basically massacring them all the time. So a lot of people's first encounter with D&D as well in tournaments and whatnot would be these really hard dungeon crawls, which then would be repackaged as adventure modules for anyone to buy to further extend the D&D product line, and that would then further cement the fact that these dungeon crawls are the quote-unquote proper way to play Dungeons & Dragons. There was not a lot of going out and just developing characters and having adventures and that kind of thing. It really was all based on the dungeon crawling. So you would think that most of the early video games, or computer games really, to hone in more definitively, would be based around that too. And actually the answer is they were not. Which at first glance may be somewhat counterintuitive, but when you look at it a little more closely, makes perfect sense. Because when we are talking about the computer systems that were available in the mid-1970s, the vast majority of these systems, and we're going to get to a very important exception, of course, but the vast majority of these systems were time-shared mainframes with limited resources for each user, because these would be computers with very expansive memory, but that memory is being sliced up 500, 1,000, 1,500 different ways, and which are still relying on largely teletypes for a display. Some computers are using CRTs at this point, CRT dumb terminals, but a lot of them are still using teletypes. What this means is if you're trying to do something real time, like, say, explore a dungeon where zombies are coming right for you, you're having to constantly update the space as you explore it, you're talking about printing out reams and reams and reams and reams of paper and basically having to be like, take 2 steps, print. Take 2 more steps, print. And this constant churn, which is both slow and wasteful.
Not to mention the poor IT person who had to fix the printer because it jammed, or it ran out of ink, or it ran out of paper, or something.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, nothing illustrates this better than Don Daglow's attempt at doing his own D&D game at Pomona in California, because he tried to recreate this dungeon crawling experience on a regular PDP-10 mainframe. This is a lost game. We don't have any screenshots, or we only have Daglow's recollections of how it works. It's not like it's something you can play today. But Daglow himself fully admitted that his game, which he called Dungeon, was very clunky, very slow, and just generally didn't work all that well. We don't really know of any other dungeon crawls from that period, outside of those that appeared on one very specific computer system that we will, of course, cover in a bit. if these games existed, and there probably were a couple of others, if Daglo's doing it, somebody else is probably doing it somewhere. During this early period in the mid-70s, the games would not probably be very fun, they would not be very memorable, and they wouldn't have disseminated in the same way as the Star Treks and Wumpuses of the world and Lunar Landers that were just a lot more fun to play. So we don't really have any real examples of these kind of games from that time period, and I think hardware limitations has got to be the reason why. That doesn't mean, though, that these traditional mainframe minicomputer systems were not getting games that were inspired by D&D. It's just it came through a slightly circuitous route. Because there was one group of players up in New England that rejected this traditional model of D&D, played the game in a very different manner, and also happened to have very ready access to computer systems. This led to the creation of one of the most important games of the mainframe era. Just to set the stage here, as we said in other episodes, a lot of the early spread of D&D was through colleges and through college wargaming clubs especially. This was no less true in institutions like MIT and Harvard. MIT had a very active wargaming group, going all the way back to the Avalon Hill General Opponents Wanted days. Harvard had groups that were playing it as well, and it's actually at Harvard, rather than MIT, that this story begins with a student by the name of Eric Roberts. Roberts was introduced to D&D very early through Harvard clubs, and he was also working as an intern with Bolt, Baranek, and Newman, BBN, which was one of the very important defense contractors involved in the creation of the ARPANET. So he had contacts with people at BBN as well, which was this very important defense contractor that was doing a lot of computer work. One person they had contact with there was a fellow by the name of Dave Walden, who was, just an engineer that worked at BBM. At one point, we don't know the exact course this took, but he knew Roberts, but at some point he ended up back in Roberts' dorm where Roberts introduced him, Robertson, as Walden described it in a memoir he wrote, Some Women Friends of His. That's how Walden describes it. I was visiting Eric Roberts at his Harvard dorm on the Ratcliffe campus one night and participated with him and some women friends of his, a D&D game. There's a couple interesting things there. Obviously, he's discovering the game very early, but I also find this interesting that it was Roberts and a group of women. Because one thing that is very hard to penetrate just because there wasn't a lot of way to reckon this back then is how involved were women in Dungeons & Dragons? I don't want to get caught on a tangent on this because the short answer is we just don't know. Certainly, the wargaming community was very, very overwhelmingly white male. But there's some anecdotal evidence out there, including this account of Walden's, that women were very early on drawn to Dungeons & Dragons, which, of course, not, everyone is their own person and people have many different likes and dislikes that are different from other people that would be considered similar to them. But to generalize just a little bit, it is true that if you look at the video games, which is instructive here, that are popular with women, they tended to have been games that involve more collaboration rather than straight out competition. They tend to be games that involve more problem solving than just mowing down everything in sight. So you could kind of see how Dungeons & Dragons would resonate with women as well as men. So this is just an aside, it's a tangent, but I find it interesting that this guy, Dave Walden's first game of D&D was in a group of people that it sounds like, according to his recollection, were mostly women. Eric was the dungeon master of the group, and Dave sat in on the game, and, that's the classic way to get introduced to Dungeons & Dragons, is to just play the darn thing, and Walden was absolutely entranced by it, and he immediately told all of his friends at BBN that they absolutely needed to try this game. It's amazing, and Eric is an incredible dungeon master, and we should let him run a game for us. He's an intern, I believe, at this point at BBN. At some point he becomes an intern. I'm not sure if he was quite yet, but, he kind of knows the BBN people. They know him, even though he's a college student. So Roberts does so. He runs a group for these BBN engineers that is under the moniker the Mirkwood Tales. According to Walden, they really didn't have any D&D stuff. I mean, Roberts was familiar with the game. Roberts must have had the original box set or something, but the game that they were playing did not revolve around D&D materials at all. It was barely D&D from the sound of it. The thing that really set this apart from a lot of other games is they were not in any way interested in the hack and slash. You know, some of these guys, they're a little older, they're engineers. I mean, they're not old, you know, they're probably late 20s, early 30s kind of crowd. They're really just not into the murder hobo thing. But what they really find fascinating is going through a series of rooms and advancing via puzzle solving. They love the idea of solving puzzles in order to figure out these dungeons or underground spaces that they're exploring. You know, these days, that's not so surprising. There are so many different ways to play Dungeons & Dragons, but back then it was just a little bit unusual. Obviously, everyone had a great time with this. The campaign went on for a couple of years. Roberts even wrote up a kind of after-action report on the entire campaign, because they're engineers. That's what engineers do. They do things, and they write reports about the things that they did. Called the Mirkwood Tales, that has kind of preserved all of this for posterity. Somewhere or another. I haven't seen it, but it exists. I mean, it still extant somewhere. The reason this is so significant is that one of those BBN players that was in this Mirkwood Tales campaign was Will Crowther, whom we've obviously talked about before, who is the creator, programmer, and designer of the game Adventure, the game that started an entire genre that's named after it. As we've talked about in other episodes, we're not going to go deep on any particular game here. It's more about the overall flow of how this worked. He had gotten divorced. He was afraid of losing touch with his children, his two young girls. He wanted a way to connect with them. He thought, basically, what if I take this style of D&D that we're playing, again, a style that hinges way more on problem solving than it does on murder hoboing, set it in a caving complex that I know really well, part of the Mammoth Cave complex in Kentucky, because he was also a fanatical caver as well. Have the whole thing respond to natural language commands instead of the typical commands you would use in a programming language, so that my young daughters can understand what's going on and actually play the bloody thing. Yeah, I'll have a fun little game. So, of course, he does that. He creates the game that would become known as Adventure. You know, he's at BBN, which has the ARPANET, because BBN is literally building it. Not all on its own, but they're one of the major players in that. So when he's done with this thing, he's just like, I'll put a copy on the ARPANET server here at the BBN, because why not? And then he went off on like a skiing holiday. You know, it was just a distraction. He didn't care about sharing it with anyone but his daughters. But, I guess he's like, what the heck? I've made this thing. I might as well put it on here. Then, of course, by the time he gets back from his skiing holiday, it is a massive nationwide phenomenon. Amongst those that have a connection to the ARPANET, which is admittedly not a large portion of the population. But amongst those people, it has become an absolute phenomenon. The story goes, which I'm sure is apocryphal, but it's instructive on the impact that this game had. The story goes is that Willie Crowther put Adventure up on the ARPANET, and for 2 weeks, no work got done at any computer lab in the United States. Obviously not true, but it just goes to show. And yes, as Ethan says, that may be the later version as well that's really told about that. But regardless of whether it's Crowther's version or the Crowther's Woods version, it's still instructive of what impact this game had. And of course, one of the people that saw it was a student at Stanford named Don Woods, who saw it in the medical center. Then we have the whole story. He wanted to modify it, but not without permission. So he just sent emails to every Will Crowther on the ARPANET, because there weren't that many of them. Got a response back. Added in more elements, including the Tolkien-esque elements, because Crowther was not a Tolkien person, but Woods was, and released it in his own version in early 1977, which truly took the ARPANET by storm and was much more widely disseminated. and is indeed probably the one that is said to have lost all of that productivity all over the country. Again, it's not hard to see why, because solving adventure is using a parser with its 2-letter commands to figure out the commands you need to give the system in order to solve the puzzles, get the treasures, because this is a D&D, an early D&D thing, so it's all about treasure hunting, because that's really what OD&D was all about. This one has fewer monsters to kill in it than is typical. There's a little bit of antagonist in here, but way fewer monsters than normal because the Mirkwood Tales people were just completely different kind of D&D players. But still, it's a treasure hunt because D&D at this time was a treasure hunt. You basically had to figure out the system and figure out how to master the system. It's the same kind of thrill that a programmer got from figuring out how a computer worked and figuring out how to program the computer to do what they wanted. It hit that same kind of high, and so everyone was fascinated by it. They were driven crazy by it, to the point that if they couldn't find the last few points in the game, because the way it worked is there were a certain number of points, and you knew what the maximum was, and you were trying to find all the points, they would go in and attempt to hack the game to figure out what they were missing. Cheating on these games is just as old as playing these games, because there was a particularly nasty point in it. There was one point that you got, there was this particular magazine that you could pick up in one room, and that magazine wasn't used to solve any puzzles. But there was this one place that if you threw the magazine into this pit, it would give you 1 point. That was the point that most people tended to miss without cheating at the game. Just a little aside. Even though adventure doesn't seem very much like D&D at all if you were to play it today, this foundational, seminal game in the computer space entirely came about because of a D&D campaign that was being played very early, run by Eric Roberts, who was exposed to Dungeons & Dragons near the beginning. Of course, from there, you have so many follow-on effects. The biggest one is that adventure becomes an object of fascination around the AI lab, the dynamic modeling group at MIT. From there, you get a group of 4 programmers that decide that they will create their own version of adventure with a better parser. This group was doing a lot of work with artificial intelligence and a lot of work with more advanced parsers and whatnot, and so they were like, hey, this adventure thing is really cool, but that parser is really terrible, and whoever did that should be ashamed of themselves. Of course, Crowther wasn't worried about building a sophisticated parser. He just wanted something his daughters could enjoy. So in his mind, I'm sure he thought the simpler the better. But as is always the case with programmers and engineers, if you give them something done by someone else, they'll say, oh, that's great, but I can do it better. Then they take that challenge and decide they'll make it better. So Mark Blank, Dave Liebling, Tim Anderson, and Bruce Daniels decided to make their own version, which they initially called Dungeon, but eventually had to change to Zork, because one thing about TSR that we did not cover before is these were very litigious people. They would sue anyone that got anywhere near Dungeons and or Dragons, and Dungeon was just not going to fly. This is also the reason that Jeffrey and I played the Dragon Warrior series as kids instead of the Dragon Quest series.
Darn you, TSR.
Indeed. They ended up having to change the name to Zork, but this was adventure, but with a more advanced parser that allowed for more varied and interesting puzzles, and even a little bit more D&D action in it. Because through an absolute one of these weird coincidences of history, when Willie Crowther left Eric Roberts' D&D group, his replacement was none other than Dave Liebling. They did not play in the group at the same time, but they both played in the same group. So the other 3 that created the original version of Dungeon/Zork, they had not been exposed to D&D, but Liebling had been. So he included some combat encounters with a very, very, very rudimentary kind of combat engine, in addition to the usual puzzle solving. Zork, of course, spreads widely as well. It plays a key role in the foundation of the personal computer game industry when the Zork people decide to join with some other MIT people and form the company Infocom and release Zork, first through Personal Software and then under their own label. But even aside from that, even before that, Zork or Dungeon proliferated around networks in the very same way that Adventure had before it. One place that it ended up in its Dungeon incarnation, not called Zork yet, was Exeter University in the United Kingdom, where it was discovered by Roy Trubshaw and Richard Bartle, who thought, this is cool, and guess what? I found a way to kind of hack together running multiple copies of this at the same time so multiple people can be in the same place. So we were inspired by Dungeon, and this dungeon that we're going to create can support multiple people, so we'll call it a multi-user dungeon.
That makes sense.
Of course, that game was very quickly shortened to MUD. MUD was, again, it was another extension of this kind of adventure and Zork gameplay. Most of what was going on in there was puzzle solving, but once again, just as Zork had a little more combat than adventure did, MUD had a little more combat than Zork did. Again, it was not a very robust combat engine, but you had combat, you had small numbers of monsters around that you had to fight, and more importantly, it supported the ability to do PvP, player versus player. One of the very early games to allow that in a RPG kind of setting. The other wrinkle that it had is, all of these were point games. Adventure, collect treasures to get enough points. Zork, solve puzzles, collect stuff to get a certain number of points. Well, with MUD, they were going to go with something of a point system as well for completing tasks and quests and whatnot. But of course, this is going to be a persistent world with multiple people in it. It's not going to be just a explore this fixed space all by yourself, complete everything there is to do, and you'll know you won the game because you collected all the points. Yes, indeed, Ethan, you haven't lived until you've died in MUD. I used the copy of that ad in our presentation at DragonCon, the famous ad, you haven't lived until you've died in MUD.
I've died a lot in MUD.
So they extrapolated that point system into a full-fledged experience and leveling system, like you would find in traditional D&D. So you actually had leveling in this game, unlike in Adventure or Zork/Dungeon. So right there, we have a complete continuum, Dungeons and Dragons, and obviously we're oversimplifying a little bit to do the bird's eye picture. There's always more nuance, but basically, Dungeons and Dragons birthed the entire adventure game genre and birthed the entire MUD and then MMO genre. You haven't lied until you've died in Isles of Kesmai. Why didn't the genie people have you around to write copy back in the 80s, Ethan? They could have used you. That's one of those large chains of influence, and that's basically what we're going to look at here is very high-level chains of influence. We're not going to get too far into the nitty-gritty. So that was one track. Then, of course, a side track from that is that you have our friends Michael Toy and Glenn Wickman, who we discussed in detail in our Rogue episode, so we won't go into that again here, who were fascinated by adventure as well, and games like it, but were incredibly disappointed when those games were solved and there was just nothing else you could do in the game. So they thought to themselves, wouldn't it be great to have a game like this, except every time you play, it's different every time? So they came up with the idea of doing a randomly generated space and then discovered the Curses library that allowed them to have very rudimentary form of graphics. Long story short, but if you want the long story, you can listen to our episode on it. They created Rogue, which is not a direct spawn of adventure in the same way that MUD is, but was still kind of created as a response to, as an answer to that kind of gameplay by two more people that were very into dungeon crawling and all of this kind of thing. So we can also bring the whole roguelike genre back to this inflection point as well, which is so popular as we discuss in our Rogue two-parter today, in especially the indie scene. So that was kind of the main track where these kind of games were originally infiltrating mainframes, just because of the limitations that we discussed on those systems at the time. But of course, there was one very famous example of a system that could handle just a little bit more sophistication than your typical mainframe and mini computer. The Programming Logic for Automated Teaching Operation, or PLATO system, at the University of Illinois. PLATO was truly unique. It's a word that gets used too much, but was truly unique for its time period, because it was a massively time-shared system By the time PLATO 4 is launched in 1972, you can have 1,000 users connected at the same time that has enough processing capability to support real-time graphics on fancy plasma displays, some of the very first plasma displays ever created. So high-definition displays, not high definition as we define HD today, but high definition compared to other terminals that were available at that time. We're not talking 1080p, but we're talking about some pretty good graphics here.
Especially for the time.
Yes. Monochrome, and the gas, the plasma used in the display, was a naturally orange gas. So they were monochrome in orange, which is why the seminal book, where we get a lot of our information on what was going on there, is a book called The Friendly Orange Glow by Brian Deere, which please do not confuse with Mr. William Deere from the previous episode, as these are two very different people. The PLATO system had all sorts of wonderful modern advances. It was basically a microcosm of the internet as it exists today, just within this one contained time-sharing system, because you had email, you had instant messaging, you had multiplayer networked gaming, you had all sorts of craziness, all with real graphics. Not as impressive as the graphics you can get today, but way more impressive than the graphics you were getting in CRTs anywhere else at the time. This allowed for the creation of some games that were just a little more faithful to the D&D experience than you could get anywhere else. Once again, the path that most of this took to get here was through the introduction of D&D to wargaming clubs, because the very earliest game that we know of, the first dungeon crawl that we know of on this system, was created by a wargamer who was introduced to D&D and fell in love with it. This individual was a guy named Rusty Rutherford, Rusty obviously being a nickname, not his given name.
Not Rusty Venture.
No, not Rusty Venture, who was a member of a group called the University of Illinois Conflict Simulation Society. Fancy way of saying they were wargamers. So he was a wargamer, the group was introduced to D&D, he became a fanatic D&D gamer, and he thought, wouldn't it be neat to maybe try to recreate this D&D game on the computer, on the PLATO computer that he works with? There's some confusion about the ultimate inspiration for this. He's told his story to two different people, both kind of briefly. He told it to Brian Deere for the Friendly Orange Glow. He also, years before that, did an interview with Matt Barton, where he also discussed the origin of the game. When he talked to Barton, he said that the reason he chose to do this game is because there was another game on the system called D&D that was supposedly being worked on, but was never actually appearing on the system. That would be all fine and good as a recollection, except for the fact that the creators of the aforementioned D&D, which we'll go into a little more detail on later, say that they only started working on their game because they were exposed to Rutherford's game. So both of those things can't be true. There was another game being worked on somewhere in here. PLATO was housed at the University of Illinois, where Rusty Rutherford was, but there were a small number of remote terminals at other colleges, mostly in the Midwest, that could also access the main PLATO system. One of those was at the University of Iowa. There was a student there by the name of John Dulesky and some friends, Gary Fritz and others, who were also avid programmers. Iowa State University, not the University of Iowa. I knew that. At Iowa State University, not the University of Iowa, who had discovered the PLATO system and were programming it like crazy as well. And Dulesky was really doing a lot of 3D graphical work because he was an art guy and was really interested in his ability to do 3D art kind of stuff. But he was also making games. He made the game Empire. He was working on a 3D, we think, dungeon crawling game at around the same time that was also called Dungeon, of which only a title screen has survived to this day. So I do have to wonder, because that game ultimately ended up never being finished. I mean, I think it was playable in some way, shape, or form at some time, but it was never finished. And according to Deer's book, it was always a little bit finicky. So I think there's a big possibility that perhaps that's the game that Rutherford was waiting for that was never showing up rather than D&D. But it's also possible that that was just a complete misremembering, because when he talked to Deer, he made no reference to any other games. He was just like, yeah, I played D&D, I liked it a lot, and I decided that it would be cool to recreate it on the PLATO system. So maybe there wasn't even another game that our good friend Reginald, Rusty to his friends, had played. Either way, he decided it would be cool to do this thing, and so he created a game that he called The Dungeon, but which is normally called Petit 5 today because that was the lesson space where he was working in, because he was working for a professor in the population and energy group, which is where Petit comes from. And that's why he had access to the PLATO and had access to a space that he could program in. There were a couple of spaces within the Petit allotment that were not being used for official work, so he snuck this game into Petit 5. So it's often called that by people, but its real proper name is The Dungeon. This was a very rudimentary, top-down dungeon game. You had a very nice-looking avatar in it because the PLATO system was capable of pretty decent graphics, and you had a few of the D&D attributes. You didn't have all of them, but you had strength and con and dex. You had gear, you had the ability to do spells. You had a variety of enemies to fight that themselves had pretty cool graphics to them because, again, the computer could do that. You would explore this dungeon and kill monsters, gain levels, up to 5 levels, get some better equipment, swords with better stats and whatnot, and just try to, I guess, make the Hall of Fame, because he kind of had a Hall of Fame based on how well you did in gathering experience and gold and killing things. There wasn't a lot to it. He only had so much time and space and effort that he could put into this. But as far as we know, this was the very first dungeon crawl. And even if it's not the very first, because you know how we feel about first that they create worlds, it was certainly the first completed one on the PLATO system and was the first in a line of games that would end up being influential in the transition to microcomputers. As Ethan says in chat here, yeah, that high score is basically the first high score table in a way. It's being used very differently from in the arcade, but that Hall of Fame would predate high score tables in coin-operated games, where, of course, they were at their most famous. That's Petit 5. It disappeared very quickly because it was written in an unauthorized space. Now, games were not strictly forbidden on the PLATO system. Nobody was going around and trying to eliminate every last game on the system. There were usually pretty strict rules on when you could play them. They didn't want them to be played in the middle of the day when everyone was trying to do, like, real work on the machines. There would often be administrators roaming around killing every instance of various games they could find during peak hours to stop them from stealing system resources. But they weren't strictly forbidden on the system. However, there was the wrinkle in this case that Rutherford had created the game in this Petit 5 space that was reserved for actual work. So that really wasn't the place to have a game, which would cause it to be deleted rather quickly. But it was around long enough that other people got a look at it and liked it and were disappointed enough when it went away that they wanted to do something about that and be able to play it for themselves, which led to a lot of cloning of the game. At this point, I want to briefly address another game that has been incorrectly in multiple sources, including Deer, because Deer wasn't really looking closely into this. His book, which is wonderful, is an all-encompassing history of the PLATO system. He has a couple of chapters on games, but he is not focused on PLATO games. As the very first RPG on the system, even predating Petit 5, the enigmatic M199H. For years and years, this was a phantom game that old-time PLATO people, a few would say, yeah, and then like before Petit 5, there was like M199H, but like it didn't last very long. But yeah, it was even before Rusty's game. Well, more recently, there's been some great work done by the CRPG Addict and others who were able to get into contact with some people who had access to the PLATO system back in the day. Most notably, a guy by the name of Don Gillies, whose father had been a professor at University of Illinois, and so Don had had some access as a student to PLATO. He actually remembered playing M199H and even had some materials that he had created himself, maps and graphics and whatnot, that he had created himself at the time, illustrating portions of the game. From Gillies' documents, the CRPG Addict and others were able to pretty definitively determine that M199H was actually a fork off of Rusty Rutherford's game, the Petit 5 game. So it actually pretty convincingly postdates Petit 5 and was actually a fork from Petit 5. So there you have it. M199H is a big fat lie. It did exist, but it was not the earliest. It really does seem that Petit 5 was the earliest. And even if there is some other ephemeral game, the dungeon crawl that lasted for 10 seconds on the system before Petit 5, it's not really that important because Petit 5 is the font from which everything springs. Because even though the Petit 5 version of the dungeon goes away very quickly, another group that saw the game and loved it were able to preserve it in a more permanent form in the game Orthanc, named for Saruman the White Tower at Isengard in the Lord of the Rings series, which is basically just Rusty Rutherford's dungeon game, but not immediately deleted because it was created in a place where it shouldn't have been created. That's kind of the very first one, and as I said, it continued to survive in the form of Orthanc, but it inspired a couple of programmers down at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, by the name of Ray Wood and Weisenhunt. They had been very interested by Petit 5 when it appeared, but they were also very vexed at the fact that it kept disappearing over and over and over again. They were D&D players. They had played Dungeons & Dragons down at Carbondale, but they weren't that big into it. In fact, I'm not sure Weisenhunt even played it at all, but Wood did. He wasn't like a super huge fan of it. However, they were fascinated by the program itself, the dungeon crawling game, and they thought it would be a cool kind of challenge to recreate it. Plus, it would have the added benefit that if they recreated it, it would stay on the network for everybody to play. Because Weisenhunt was essentially a system admin. I mean, he didn't have the official title, but the staff at Carbondale, because they're far away from the focal point of this at the University of Illinois, so there's not like a lot of PLATO staff on hand. The staff at Carbondale were kind of like, you seem to know what you're doing with this thing. We'll let you help us maintain it. So he basically maintained Carbondale's terminals and their creation space, which guaranteed that no one was going to bump their game off of the system. They created their own take on the dungeon, which is commonly, again, because of file names, called D&D, all lowercase, the three letters D&D, but was really called The Game of Dungeons, which is incredibly similar, but it's not a straight copy of Rutherford's game. It is more sophisticated. The thing that's most interesting about it compared to other games is they actually had a quest.
We gave them a quest, huh?
Yes, there was actually a thing you were supposed to be doing, which was descending to the lowest level of this dungeon, which again was in overhead view, similar to how Rutherford's was, and retrieve a golden orb, and then make it back up, return with it to the surface. They actually included a guardian for that golden orb, a big old dragon, that some people have called, as a result, the very first boss in a video game. I'm not sold on all of those firsts and definitions and everything else, but regardless, it was one of the first times where you had a defined objective in a game like this, and to complete that objective, you had to actually overcome a specific foe. Another thing that they did that would become kind of standard in these kind of games in the early days was, in addition to your normal way of traversing dungeon levels like stairs and whatnot, they also decided, just for the fun of it, later games, particularly on microcomputers, did this oftentimes to overcome limitations. But in the case of this one, they literally, according to Deere's book, just did it for the fun of it. As an homage to Star Trek, which they were also fans of, they put transporters into the game, so you would actually sometimes teleport between rooms and levels. They decided that these would not always be reliable, sometimes sending you into places where you would be damaged or perhaps even get stuck. So this was D&D, Game of Dungeons, which was basically a more advanced version of what Rusty Rutherford was doing. It would continue to grow for years. A gentleman by the name of Dirk Pellet on the system became a big fan and was a big D&D player and became a co-developer with them and added all sorts of other stuff. And it became very popular because you had this goal, and it had leaderboards and whatnot too. A lot of games had leaderboards on the PLATO system just because of the nature of how that system was built up. So people would, compete for getting down to the golden orb as fast as possible and bringing it back up and that kind of fun stuff.
Speed running.
Yes, this game was more persistent. It also ended up out in the microcomputer world through a very roundabout way, because one person at Purdue, another university that had access to the PLATO system, who really liked the game was a guy named Daniel Lawrence. He thought, this game is really cool. I'm going to recreate this on our PDP-10, because he had access to PLATO, but he was also programming in PDP-10. So he created a game that he called D&D, and swore up and down till the day he died. It's like, no, this D&D game was my creation. I never saw that. What's that? That Play-Doh system? No, I never played with Play-Doh in college.
I'm an adult, not a toddler. I'm going to play with Play-Doh. I'm going to build things with Play-Doh.
Yeah, it was all lies. Daniel Lawrence totally ripped off his D&D on the PDP-10 from Weisnantz and Wood's D&D. This is incredibly obvious to anyone, as the CRPG addict did, who looks at the two games side by side. It's similar to how there's no way Gygax came up with all of his fantasy rules for chainmail without looking at Pat because there were too many matching points of comparison. It's exactly the same with Daniel Lawrence's D&D. There are things, and I won't go point by point once again here, but there are specific things that there is no way two different people came up with, and there are too many of them. So Daniel Lawrence created a version which he called D&D, and then when Avalon Hill was getting involved in the computer game space in the early 80s, they accepted a version of that for publication as Telengard. So that's kind of the main way that these overhead dungeon crawl type Play-Doh games came out into the world. The Petit 5 and D&D style game came out through the game Telengard, published by Avalon Hill. It was kind of an evolutionary dead end for RPGs. It wasn't the dominant form, but it's kind of interesting to see how that gets out there. So in addition to this kind of 2D stuff that was going on here, one of the things that was truly outstanding about the PLATO system is you could actually do three-dimensional wireframe spaces. This was being done in a variety of genres. Like we said, John Daleski had done this with Empire in a space sim shooting game, Dynamic, and also before that, Spasm, which was the first one that kind of went in that direction. It was going on in flight simulator type games like Air Race and Air Fight, but it was also going on in the dungeon space here. It's kind of interesting. They came directly from the 2D games, but it had to do with the cross-pollination and combination of these 2D dungeon crawls coming out and Daleski doing what he was doing at Iowa that made this whole thing happen, because there were a couple of guys at Iowa State named Kevet Duncombe and Jim Batten, who had fallen in with the Play-Doh crowd, and Iowa State at that time had two Play-Doh terminals in a small room, and John Daleski and Gary Fritz and his clique were programming on one, and Duncombe and Batten and their clique were kind of programming on the other. So there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two groups, so they could see what Daleski was doing with games like Empire. They were also out there on the Play-Doh network, and they discovered Orthanc. They were not Dungeons & Dragons players at all. They knew nothing about Dungeons & Dragons. They knew nothing about J.R.R. Tolkien. They didn't know anything about anything. But they were really impressed by this Orthanc thing and thought it would be kind of fun to recreate that. Probably because of the work that Daleski was doing right next door to them, either on Empire or maybe even on his dungeon game. They thought it would be cool to do this in a three-dimensional space instead. So they created a wireframe dungeon, taking up just a small portion of the screen because it was very memory intensive, that you would explore. A friend of theirs, the very same Dirk Pellet, who worked on the D&D game eventually, suggested that they call it Moria. So despite the fact that they were neither Dungeons & Dragons players nor Tolkien aficionados, they somehow ended up with a 3D dungeon crawler called Moria. Because that's just how the world works. But this game is a really weird offshoot because they didn't know anything about Dungeons & Dragons. So they were trying to recreate the Orthanc experience. But nothing in it is derived from D&D. It has character stats because Orthanc had character stats, but it has stats like cunning and piety and valor and, dare I say it, wizardry, rather than the typical strength and constitution and dexterity. And you also had the ability to really boost those scores into the stratosphere. It was not based on the D&D paradigm where most stuff tops out at 18 other than in special circumstances. It's completely fantastical. It's completely nothing like D&D at all, except for the fact that it is vaguely a dungeon crawl because they had no access to it. This is an example of how, it's theoretically possible that the world could have evolved in a different direction where D&D was not the basis of everything. Because this here is an example of a game that even though it was inspired by a game that was inspired by D&D, it itself was not directly inspired by D&D. This was the exception, not the rule, because basically D&D was practically the only game in town at this point. There were a few others that were starting to appear, like Tunnels and Trolls and Traveler in the sci-fi space, etc., etc. But D&D still had an almost complete ironclad grip on the public imagination of this new class of gamer called a role-playing gamer or a tabletop gamer, that everything just followed it. Once you had so many games at the start following the basic D&D conventions, then it was only natural that every game that came after that would be flowing from them in some way or another. And it's not like all the early games on microcomputers were strict clones of D&D. They weren't. But they all had this common ancestor that you could look back to and take inspiration from. Even something like this, where everything is completely non-D&D except the basic setup, it still manages to mostly feel like or be understood as D&D, just because it's a derivative of a derivative. But that was not the way that the 3D games went in the long term on that PLATO system, because there would be another game that would come, this was 76, there would be another game that came in 1977 that was much more orthodox and really set the stage for everything that would come in 3D dungeon crawls afterwards. This being Jim Schwager's game, Oubliettes. Schwager, we only have a couple of interviews from him. He does not claim any influence from Moria specifically, though I have to imagine that there was at least a tiny amount. I mean, they don't look that similar to each other. They could be parallel evolutions, but it's hard to believe that he set about to do a 3D dungeon crawl and didn't know about the other dungeon crawl that was around. His inspiration, according to Schwager, was directly the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop game. This was not a copy of a copy of a copy of a PLATO game. It's different enough from Moria that I very much believe that. Basically, he's another guy that was really into Dungeons & Dragons. He was like, this game's fun, but you know what? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work keeping track of everything, and that just kind of sucks. So he was basically like, what if I recreated Dungeons & Dragons on PLATO and let it take care of all the stupid stuff? So that's what he did. He created this dungeon crawl game with, again, a 3D perspective. He threw in all of the stats. They're all here, all your favorites. Strength, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, constitution, and dexterity. He even threw a little bit of alignment stuff in there, because why not? And then threw in a bunch of classes, some of them real D&D classes, and others of them classes of his own creation. Yeah, Oubliette definitely has, I agree there, Futurist Baroque. You can definitely, in the monster list and whatnot, see that real D&D influence there as well. Another clear indicator that he was doing a lot of his own stuff and not strictly following what came before. The other thing that really set Oubliette apart, in addition to its slightly more faithful recreation of Dungeons & Dragons, is that he also wanted to represent the feeling of adventuring with your friends in these spaces. Because these early games, like Petit 5 D&D and Moria, they were single player. But the PLATO system did have the capability for multiple people to be playing the same game at the same time. It had that full networking capability. So he created a game where he figured out a way that you could explore these spaces in groups of 6. You could actually have a full party that was working together to move through and solve this dungeon and get the treasures and gain levels and become more powerful and all of this good stuff. So we even have multiplayer dungeon crawling going on here on the PLATO system in 1977, which is just, obviously leaps and bounds ahead of anything that can be done on most other mainframes and certainly on microcomputers at this point. Even though the PLATO system was the only system that could really support true dungeon crawls in the 1970s, I mean, by the time Rogue comes along in 80, 81-ish, depending on when it really actually showed up, as we talk about in our Rogue episode. By the time you get there, Rogue is kind of able to do some of that dungeon crawly stuff on more traditional mainframes through its connection with the Unix operating system. But, this is really the only place where true dungeon crawling is going on. Everyone else is doing adventure games and Star Trek games and stuff like that. Even though this was the only source, PLATO really was instrumental in the rise of popularity of these games on microcomputers as well, because you can draw a direct line from what was going on PLATO to the two most seminal games, early RPGs on microcomputers, which are Ultima and Wizardry. Now, Ultima and Wizardry were not the very first RPGs on microcomputer systems. But the early ones tended to be really primitive. The ones that came out in the 78, 79, 80 timeframe tended to be really, really primitive. And there's 2 reasons for that. You had the trinity of microcomputers, the first 3 computers that were really robust enough that they started attracting more than just a hobbyist crowd, but were starting to move slightly more into the mainstream, this being the Commodore PET, the TRS-80, and the Apple II. Well, the TRS-80 and the Commodore PET couldn't do real graphics. They could only do character-based graphics. So that really limited what you could do on those systems. The Apple II had real graphics, but the only choices you had were a low-res mode that had very gigantic sprites, and so everything was these big, ugly blocks. You can't even call that pixelated. They were blockulated. Or you had a high-res mode, which took so much memory that most early Apple users couldn't actually use high-res mode in any real way, shape, or form. It really took until the Apple II Plus came out to be able to fully unlock high-res mode. But 2 was incredibly hard to program in effectively because Woz is a mad genius that does stuff that no sane person would ever attempt to do with computers. So most programmers didn't really have the ability to program effectively in high res, and even if they could, nobody had a computer that could run it. So in the very early days, you were either doing character-based graphics on the PET or the TRS-80, or you were doing low-res graphics on the Apple II. All of that was just blocky, blocky, blocky. So what do you get in that kind of situation? Well, you can still sort of do a dungeon crawler, because even character-based blocky graphics means that you can build some walls. And you can put some really rudimentary shapes and characters within those walls to represent monsters and treasures and whatnot. You really can't do anything very sophisticated. There were kind of 2 paths that this went. First, you had the earliest games on the Apple II, most notably a game called Beneath Apple Manor by Don Worth, and a game called Dungeon Adventure by a Boeing engineer up in Seattle by the name of Bill Clardy, who created very simple maze-like dungeon experiences, both of them taking inspiration from the same game, a game called Dragon Maze that showed up in the Apple II Programmer's Handbook, created by a guy named Gary Shannon, who's a very interesting early figure that we won't cover here. But my man Ethan knows who Gary is because of that Sega connection.
Sega. Oh, great. Now you said Sega. Now everyone's going to like this episode.
But it's not that Sega. It's not the Sega everyone likes. It's that Sega Incorporated company that everybody hates. So it's okay. It's not Sega Enterprises Limited. Dragon Maze was just a very, very rudimentary maze game where you are controlling a blob, because that's all the graphics could really be, in a maze, and you are trying to escape the maze while a dragon that is another blob is chasing you. And it's not a real-time game. It's just that the dragon is programmed to approach you by the shortest path possible. So every time you take a step, the dragon takes a step, always trying to get closer to you. And so you have to move bit by bit to try to get out of the maze. So it's a fun little game. Both Clardy and Worth looked at that and were like, hey, they're both Dungeons & Dragons players. And they're like, hey, I bet I can make a very rudimentary dungeon crawl by just making a slightly more advanced maze and throwing some monsters to fight in there and stuff like that. So those were a couple of the very earliest ones you got. And then you had a couple of guys, Jim Connolly and John Freeman, who had founded a company called Automated Simulations. Connolly founded it and then brought Freeman in with stock afterwards. They were part of a D&D group as well. Connolly had been an avid wargamer in college and had also been introduced to D&D. He wasn't as big into D&D as he was into wargaming. You know, it was a good social activity to do with groups of people, so he ended up becoming a DM of his own game. Freeman ended up being part of that game. He was a guy that was very well known in game circles. He would write rules for games and he would review games. He was a published author on games and was also enamored with D&D. I think he wrote one of the earliest reviews of D&D even. They decided to get together and create a strategy game called Starfleet Orion, which was a ship-to-ship combat game. It had nothing to do with RPGs, but they took this game to DundraCon on the West Coast, one of the very first Dungeons & Dragons-focused conventions, and everyone was like, hey, yeah, that's a kind of neat game, I guess, but you know this is a Dungeons & Dragons convention, right? So what would really be cool is if you made a Dungeons & Dragons game. So they're like, okay, I guess we could do that. So Connolly, the better programmer, did the engine. John Freeman, who had background in designing games, did the game design, and they created Temple of Apshai. And the interesting thing about what they did, which is kind of different from everyone else, is they really emulated the D&D system. Because in D&D, you had the D&D box set, and then you had a few supplements to that, like World of Greyhawk and whatnot. But then you also had adventure modules. So once you had the base game and kind of had all the rules there, you could then apply that to pre-canned, pre-made dungeon crawls adventure modules. So they created Apshai and, you know, had a scenario in that, but then they used that same engine and did a series of what today we would almost call expansions, but were really, in their mind, adventure modules. They were cheaper games with usually fewer levels that adhered to all the same rules that Apshai did because it was the same engine. They were kind of following that TSR pattern of release the base game and then release a bunch of additional adventure modules you can play in that space. Apshai was kind of the first semi-successful. It had a decent run, CRPG, but, you know, all of this stuff is very primitive. I mean, the Commodore PET's graphics are so primitive that they have to put the room descriptions for Apshai in the instruction manual because there's no way with those graphics to depict anything interesting on the screen. The real start of the kind of microcomputer revolution in RPGs was really Ultima and Wizardry, and both of those in one way or another can trace themselves back to the PLATO system. In Wizardry's case, it's direct. Wizardry is basically oubliette. They lifted it almost wholesale. I'm not sure what the reference here is, Ethan. What are you referring to? Are you referring to like a Let's Play video, or I'm not sure I know of this playthrough. I may have to check that out, or more properly, Jeff's going to have to check that out to put in the show notes.
Oh, no.
You hear that, editing Jeffrey? Show notes.
The show notes for these episodes are going to be a nightmare. Editing Jeffrey here at 2:40 on December 14th, 2024. Yes, this is a nightmare and chaos to edit.
Indeed. Basically, and we have an episode on Surtech that goes into this story, and we don't have to go into huge detail here, but basically Wizardry was created by Andrew Greenberg and Robert Woodhead. Andrew Greenberg was a Cornell student, which also at some point got themselves some PLATO terminals, who was a big Dungeons & Dragons player, and who was also exposed to all of these dungeon crawls on the PLATO system. So as he puts it in his own words, or put it in his own words, he sadly passed away just a couple of months ago. As Greenberg himself put it, one day, he was just kind of feeling kind of blah. It was like kind of around finals time, and he was just feeling blah and didn't want to do anything. One of his friends was just like, well, why don't you put Dungeons & Dragons on the computer? Greenberg's like, yeah, why don't I put Dungeons & Dragons on the computer? So he went upstairs and he immediately started coding a game that he called Basic Wizardry on his Apple II. Clearly, as I said, taking from Oubliette. Again, we're not going point by point on these things in this episode, but there's a lot of Oubliette in Wizardry. A whole lot. Like
90, 95%?
Yeah, I mean, again, they added a little bit of their own twist to it. It's not entirely a ripoff, but it is basically Oubliette for the Apple II. He's doing this, but he's doing it in BASIC. He doesn't know a lot. I mean, he's been on PLATO and he's worked in Tutor. I mean, he's a programmer, but he hasn't really worked a lot in the Apple II. So he's just kind of trying to do this in BASIC, and that's a pretty complex game to try to do in BASIC. But he learns that there's another guy, Robert Woodhead, who is also trying to adapt the dungeon crawls of the PLATO system onto the new microcomputers like the Apple II. They kind of sort of knew each other, but not well, because Woodhead was a system administrator at Cornell for PLATO. It was his job to hunt down everyone that was playing games during hours that they shouldn't have been playing them and kicking them off. Greenberg was one of those people playing those games. Now that would be hilarious Omega number if they had included Oubliette as a secret unlockable in the new Digital Eclipse Wizardry. That would be chef's kiss. It's a shame that they did not do that. That would have been hilarious. They were kind of antagonists. I mean, they weren't mortal enemies or anything. They didn't hate each other. But Greenberg played games and Woodhead kicked off people playing games. So there was that kind of built-in kind of rivalry there. Woodhead also liked games, and he liked D&D. I mean, he liked all this stuff. And in fact, he had been exposed to All's 101 Basic Computer Games before he even went off to college. He really liked games. It's just, he had a job to do. So Greenberg was a little surprised to learn that Woodhead, of all people, was making games, but it actually made perfect sense in context. Woodhead had one advantage over Greenberg. That is, he knew how to program in a little language called Apple Pascal. You know a little bit about Pascal, don't you, Jeffrey? Just a little bit?
Very little. I never actually really programmed in it. When they were going to teach us that, it was the year that came before me was the last year they taught it.
Figures. It was a lot more powerful language than BASIC, and in some ways even a lot more flexible than some of the other languages that were available on the Apple II computer at the time. Woodhead had the programming chops to actually do Oubliette justice on a microcomputer. He was working on a game he called Paladin, I should mention. Greenberg, I think it seems like, must have had the better game design, because the sense I get from the interviews that they give is that they mostly deferred to what Greenberg had been making in terms of game design. He had the better game design. We did the Pascal talk on the Surtech episode, repeating yourselves. Yes, when you get to 222, 223, 250,000, like we have, sometimes you just gotta talk about the same things over and over again.
Not to mention that you never know when someone's coming in, and they might not have A, the recall, or B, the experience of listening to that earlier episode. They might be coming at it from this one of like, oh, I like D&D. I'll listen to the thing about D&D. And they go like, what, Wizardry and Surtech? Oh, I'll have to go listen to that one. That leads them to go down different rabbit holes, and that's the hope.
I think it's more likely that they'll be like, ooh, an episode on D&D. I like D&D. What's all this shit about Bronsteins and Totten and Strategos? That's not D&D. I'm never listening to this stupid podcast again. We are professional streamers that know how to grow our audience, Jeffrey.
That's why we have a whole 8 of them.
And we are happy that each and every one of you are here, truly. So this ended up being a combination of kind of Greenberg's game design and Woodhead's programming chops, though obviously both were able to do both, so there was cross-pollination there. That ended up with this game Wizardry, and of course, it couldn't be multiplayer because there was that very real limitation on the early microcomputers. You still controlled a party of multiple characters, it's just that you, a single player, were controlling the entire party rather than engaging in multiplayer dungeon crawl shenanigans. It basically recreated that three-dimensional oubliette PLATO dungeon crawl experience with all of the fun character classes and stats and gear and monsters and that tiny little window up in the corner that showed this wireframe 3D dungeon space that you were walking around in. So that's one, that's Wizardry. Ultima, obviously, is not quite the same straight line as that, because Richard Garriott was not exposed to the PLATO system. He was down in Texas, nowhere near a PLATO system. His exposure to computers came in high school via teletype in his school that was hooked into a traditional mainframe, God knows where. He was exposed to Dungeons & Dragons. He was exposed to it at a summer camp in 1977. He sometimes says it's 1974. He's wrong. I know his life better than he does, ? He's also said 77 at times, too, and 77 is definitely correct. So he was exposed to D&D, and he played it, and he liked it, and ended up getting himself a custom computer class that he could take, where he basically just made D&D games all day long. None of that has anything to do with the PLATO system, obviously. None of these early games that he did, which were very crude, were games that he was very interested in publishing. He kind of took a turn in a different direction when he beheld a maze game called Escape, that, unlike the Dragon Mage of Gary Shannon, was a three-dimensional maze that you wandered around in. It was created by a PLATO programming legend by the name of Silas Warner, who had been a PLATO administrator at Purdue and then later got a job at CDC, which bought the whole PLATO thing to commercialize it, to be a PLATO administrator for them as well. As far as I know, Escape is not based on any games that he made on the PLATO system. He was very active in the gaming scene on PLATO, and he did programming of games on PLATO. I don't think Escape necessarily was specifically one that he did there. But I also can't imagine that his decision to make something as ridiculous, and I mean that in the nicest way possible, it's only ridiculous because to have the audacity to think you can get an Apple II to do this is ridiculous. But of course, Silas Warner's a genius, so he has the programming chops to back it up and actually do that. I can't imagine that the ridiculous audacity to create a three-dimensional maze game on the Apple II could not have been inspired by all of the 3D games that he was playing on the PLATO system. So Silas Warner creates Escape. Richard Garriott realizes that his life up to this point had no meaning and recreates his most recent D&D experimental little game as a three-dimensional dungeon crawl called Akalabeth, and the road to Ultima has begun. It is a more tenuous link. It's not like Wizardry, which is literally just a ripoff of a PLATO game. But we are still getting there. 28B, to be exact. But yes, D&D 28, it is indeed. And starts him on the road to creating Ultima, obviously. Ultima is not famous for being a set of 3D maze games. Ultima is famous for being games where you have a tile-based overworld that his friend Ken Arnold helped him figure out how to do. The 3D dungeons give way after the second Ultima game to the far more influential tactical combat system that he had in Ultima 3 onward. You know, it's definitely a little more... Yeah, B was the Akalabeth alterations, that's true. It's a little more tenuous of a link, but still, even though it was indirectly, Richard Garriott was kind of put on this path by a PLATO programmer who was undoubtedly using tricks that he had learned while being a PLATO programmer to do this 3D maze game. Then, of course, Ultima and Wizardry, really, almost every RPG that comes out for the next decade in the United States is either in some way an Ultima or a Wizardry clone. Not that they're all straight ripoffs, but they're all following the lead of one of those two paradigms of RPG gameplay. And if you want to take it even one step further, of course, the entire JRPG industry coming off of Dragon Quest. I realize Dragon Quest is not the first Japanese RPG. That's a whole different episode. We did that episode. We're just oversimplifying here a little bit because this is a big overview episode. Dragon Quest, which kicks off the whole JRPG thing, is very much a, Nakamura and Hori being like, I like Ultima. I like Wizardry. Let's make a game like Ultima. Let's make a game like Wizardry. Why not both? You get that tile-based overworld of Ultima combined with a combat system and combat view pane more reminiscent of Wizardry to birth the JRPG industry while we're at it. Yeah. So that's kind of how Dungeons & Dragons ended up inspiring so many of the most important genres in the early video game space. Obviously, we're not going to do it here because this is a three-parter, and we're not doing a fourth part. We're not going to take this along to further discuss how RPG elements then start creeping into non-RPGs and adventure games and get enmeshed in first-person shooters and third-person action-adventure games and all of these other genres. So that in this day and age, you can barely find a game anywhere that doesn't have some RPG element in it. We don't have time for any of that nonsense.
But what about Final Fantasy, Alex, and the eyeball in the beholder and the suing? You talked about it in the D&D presentation at DragonCon. You have to at least bring it up here.
Oh, fine. In Japan, it's weird because they got D&D later. They did not get D&D translated into Japanese until 1985. They didn't even get a real RPG product until they got the first Fighting Fantasy books, a British series of kind of choose-your-own-adventure books with RPG stats included, translated in 1984. So there were a small number of people that were exposed to it through translations, through importing or that kind of thing. Most people didn't have the D&D, so most of what they got there came in through the video games, through the computer games, because Apple IIs were imported into Japan very early, and so you had shops that were importing Apple IIs, and then you had staff of those shops starting to make games, and they were basing it on the games that were being imported from the US, like Ultima and Wizardry, and that's how you get, like, Kia, not the car company, but Yoshia Kia, the programmer, creating really weird games like Panorama Island that if you squint look like Ultima, but also what the heck is going on with the giant dong on that monster. Look it up. You didn't have a lot of direct D&D influence in the early Japanese RPGs, but they were all riffing off of Ultima and Wizardry, so, like 2 or 3 times removed you had it. But one of the only exceptions to that was the original Final Fantasy, because as we talked about in our Final Fantasy episode, Akitoshi Kawazu, one of the designers on that, actually knew and played and enjoyed D&D. So Final Fantasy has a bunch of D&D monsters in it. It has the Sahuagin in it. Sahuagin, Sahua? The Sea Devils. It has the Sea Devils in it. A Sea Devil. It also has an enemy that they call a wizard, but it's a wizard with tentacles all over its face. So yeah, that's an Illithid. Most famously, it had a Beholder. What, you don't remember the Beholder in your Final Fantasy? Well, that's because even though TSR kind of overlooked the whole Sahuagin thing and overlooked the whole Wizard Illithid thing, they were like, no, we created Beholders. That's our thing. We will sue you if you try to release that in the United States. Change it. So they had to change it to a slightly different eyeball monster, but they even originally had Beholders. So there's your Japanese anecdote right there, Jeffrey, because you asked for it. To be in complete lockstep with our presentation at DragonCon. All of that last little bit was like, what the heck is this even doing in this episode? But that's okay. We had to do it for the fans, I guess.
For the fans.
There you go. That's D&D and its influence on early computer games, early RPGs on computers and consoles, and all of that stuff in one giant 3-part extravaganza that sort of starts talking about dungeons halfway through, never really does much with that dragons thing, and only occasionally decides to talk about video games. Yeah, good job, team.
Good job, team. How much of a team do we have here? It's just you and me and editing Jeffrey and administrative Jeffrey and PR Jeffrey and...
Twitch chat. They count. They matter.
Okay, we got Twitch chat. How many of you guys are left? 7. All 7 of you who are left.
Oh, God, we lost one.
We did.
We lost one in the last little bit.
We lost a few.
I blame you making me talk about JRPGs.
No one wants to hear about that. That's okay. But it has been a long, fun, crazy ride. We started at 1 p.m. It is now, what does the prophets tell me the time is?
1 p.m. Central Daylight Time, to be exact.
Oh, you and your exactness. The prophets tell me that the time is currently almost 10 o'clock. So we've been at this for at least 9 hours, plus a few breaks. Oh, we got a level up. We got to level up. New follower.
Thank you very much, Futures Baroque. We only do these live streams, for those that don't know, we only do these big live streams once a year, but Jeffrey does from time to time, and he's trying to do it more, do live editing of the podcast. It's mostly him clicking on things faster than the human eye can track while singing songs to his cats. So if that sounds thrilling, you can always watch out for those notifications for Jeffrey's cat songs. I think Ethan would endorse Jeffrey's cat songs. Wouldn't you, Ethan Johnson, friend of the show?
Uh-oh. We broke Ethan. He's one of the lost ones. We're down to 6.
Jeff, there's a lag between us talking and getting it on stream.
You sure? Lag? What's this lag you speak of?
I endorse that like you endorse Terry Goodkind. I'm not certain that's such a glowing endorsement after all. So go ahead. We can keep talking a little bit in stream, but let's go ahead and wrap up this recording by you saying whatever words are going to get us out of this vicious time loop. Of course, we're not going to say what we're talking about next because we never do that after the live stream because it's a lot. So say something to end this nightmare, Jeffrey, for God's sake.
Well, Alex, we talked a lot about Dungeons & Dragons, its inception, its creation, its proliferation, its heresy of satanic worship or something that really just turned out to be math for nerds. Then how it influenced all these video games on computers and a few console stuff. He even touched a little bit about that Wizardry, Ultima, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest. But that just means next time on They Create Worlds, everyone out there will not know what we will talk about because Alex never knows what he's going to talk about after a live stream, and we are just going to have to wait and let the suspense build up. But that's okay. We won't tell you what it will be, but you might get a hint if you catch one of my editing sessions. So there you go. Incentive to listen to the editing sessions.
Absolutely. So, yeah, thank you, everyone, as always, for listening to the episode. An extra special thank you for all the people that came along with us on this crazy ride of streaming this over the course of 9 hours, including some that were there for the entire time. I never know why they do it, but they do, and we love them for it anyway. Yeah, that's about all from me.
All right, and we will see you next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, The Story of the People and Companies That Shaped the Video Game Industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service of your choice. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward. Found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music. Found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.